Okay, ladies and gentlemen, conference participants, welcome. It's a bit of a distance from the center of the conference, so I imagine there's still some people meandering out here. It's good to have you all with us. It's בסדר, אנחנו נתחיל. כן, אם כבר. כן, okay. This is a plenary session on the subject of the state of Jewish education today. Now, naturally, we can't talk about the state of Jewish education just about everywhere in the world. So my name is Jonathan Cohen. I teach here at the Melton Center for Jewish Education. And what we've done is we've invited some experts in some very specific aspects of Jewish education, but really the experts, the world-renowned experts in these particular areas. We have with us Dr. Alex Pomsson, who's an expert in community schools and in day school education. And we have with us Professor Jack Wertheimer, who is provost of JTS, past provost of JTS. We also went to junior high school together, but that's another story. And it was junior high school. I left before high school. And you continue. Oh, that's right. See? And that's what became of me. So Jack Wertheimer is an expert on the American Jewish community, and for our purposes, on supplementary Jewish education. Simon Paritsky, I met first in Russia when I came to a conference in 1994, and everything was in Russian, and he translated in both Hebrew and in English for the participants, including me, and I was completely astounded by his knowledge of languages. And he is now a very prominent Jewish educator in the former Soviet Union, also a former Jerusalem Fellow, and an expert on Jewish education in the former Soviet Union. And so, without any further ado, I think we'll start. So first will be Professor Jack Wertheimer on supplementary school education in North America. Bakasha.
Thanks a lot for that gracious introduction. I just have to modify it. This is not about North America. It's about the United States. Okay? And I should make a comment about that at the outset. Let me just, definition of terms. Supplementary Jewish schools. We don't have a very good terminology for this. They used to be called Hebrew schools. But as someone once observed, the only thing that students in those schools learned was to hate Hebrew. So that's not the best terminology to use. Plus, the intention of these schools is not, strictly speaking, solely to teach Hebrew or even to teach a lot of Hebrew. They often have been called congregational schools. Sometimes they're called afternoon schools, although they also meet, most of them meet actually on Sundays, and in some cases they meet on Shabbat. I use the term supplementary, as in that they are supplementary to the full-day secular studies program that students are engaged in. There are people who don't like that terminology because it sounds like it's an afterthought. And so of late, the terminology that's come into vogue is complementary. They are complementing the full-time education. As you can tell, I'm not a complementary guy. I'm a supplementary guy. And eventually there's going to be a tug of war between these two, and whoever pulls harder will eventually win. And we'll see which terminology develops. The second point that I want to make, just by way of introduction, is that the relative weight of students who are enrolled in these supplementary schools varies enormously by country. The United States, as best as I can determine, has the largest number of students enrolled receiving a Jewish education in such settings. In many other Western countries, the preponderant majority of children receive their Jewish education in an all-day school, in day schools. That's true in Canada, because we said North America. It is true in England. It's true in Australia, to give just a few examples. I would guess that in Russia, well, you'll have to tell us, but in those children who are receiving a Jewish education, probably most of them are not in a day school. Is that a fair statement? It's not a fair statement. Okay. Then you'll correct. More in camps than anything else. Right. Okay. So let me say the following as a kind of contextual comment. Yes, the preponderant majority of children in the United States, young people in the United States, who receive a Jewish education, receive it in a supplementary school setting. And outside of the Orthodox world, that is especially the case. The Orthodox world, of course, is the exception to that, where well over 90% of children from Orthodox families receive a day school education. So the supplementary schools, by virtue of that, the weight of students, deserve a great deal of attention. That's where the majority of children are getting their Jewish education. About 25 or 30 years ago, supplementary schools received a great deal of attention, but unfortunately it was of a very negative sort. There was an outpouring of research that came out in the 1970s and the 1980s, which studied, for example, what is the impact of a limited number of hours upon later Jewish identification. And as the number of contact hours or hours of exposure increases, then the likelihood of forming a stronger Jewish identity increases as well. There was research that was done in which people went into some schools and wrote portraits of what was going on in those schools. And they were not particularly flattering portraits either. And then I think it's fair to say that in the course of the 1990s, in response to the famous or infamous 1990 National Jewish Population Study in the United States, where the highlight was deemed to be the rising rates of intermarriage, day schools began to get a great deal of attention, as have summer camps. And supplementary schools were less the subject of investigation by researchers and other kinds of supporters, for that matter. That has changed over the course of the last decade or so in the form of new programs that have been created in order to help some supplementary schools strengthen their programs. There have been what are called systemic change efforts, trying, for example, to get a congregation that houses a supplementary school to work through the entire congregation how the congregation will be, to use Issa Aaron's formulation, how it will become a congregation of learners, and how the school itself cannot be segregated into a school wing that is entirely divorced from the shul wing, the sanctuary wing, but rather there needs to be far more integration taking place between the educational efforts in the school and in everything else that is taking place within the synagogue. And so a number of such systemic change initiatives have been created. There is the experiment in congregational education based at the Rhea Hirsch School at HUC in Los Angeles. There have been other such efforts created, such as the NESS initiative, which was created in Philadelphia and now is being transplanted into other communities, such as San Francisco. And the purpose here is to work over a period of years with supplementary schools to help them think through what it is that they're doing and to work on integrating the various aspects of their programs. And most recently, a new institution was brought into existence nationally. It's called PELI. It's a partnership for, I forget the exact what all the letters stand for, but it is a kind of umbrella organization similar for PEJ, the Partnership for Excellence in Jewish Education, which works in the day school sphere. PELI works in the sphere that deals with congregational or supplementary schooling. It has begun modestly. It has focused attention particularly on generating new funding for supplementary schools, as well as helping individual schools to improve their efforts. As I said, it is beginning small, but it is gradually having more of a national impact. All of these are symptomatic of a certain degree of ferment in the field of supplementary Jewish education. Which brings me now to the substance of my remarks, which have to do with two research projects projects that I was involved with that I'd like to tell you about. One of them was more demographic in nature, and it was in fact a census, although as I'll demonstrate to you, there were a few questions in this census that were also of a survey nature. Because the reason that this was done, it was funded by the Avichai Foundation, the reason it was done is because we really don't have any good numbers. We don't know how many supplementary schools there are, or at least we did not, how many children were enrolled, how are they divided by grades, and so on. This basic demographic information was at best outdated, going back several decades, and at worst it was incomplete. The most comprehensive survey or census that was undertaken in the 1950s, when the world was very different and the American Jewish community was very different. And even then, that census basically identified a sample of communities and extrapolated from that sample. So I undertook a census in which I tried, with the help clearly of many assistants, to reach every single supplementary school in the United States, and I failed. I did not reach every single one of them. But I was able to gather information from over 1,700 such schools, and based upon a variety of pieces of information that I gleaned, I estimate that, in fact, there are somewhere in the vicinity of 2,000 to 2,100 such schools in the United States alone. Many of them are quite small. Some of them are larger than that. And I want to get to some of the demographic information now with you using this PowerPoint. One of the questions that clearly was of great interest to me was overall how many students are enrolled, and also how do they break down by grades. And what you can see here very simply is something that will not come as news to anybody who has been an observer of these schools, but the virtue of this was that I was able to pin this down in terms of numbers. What you see is, of course, an upward trajectory by grade level, so that there are an increasing number of students from the first grade all the way up to the sixth grade, and starting from after grade 6, when we enter grade 7, there is a downward slope. At first it's not very sharp at all, but then after grade 7 there is a precipitous drop, and it keeps on declining, so that by grade 12 there are approximately 1/15 as many students enrolled as there are in grade 6. Okay? Now again, this is no great chidush. We've known that there's a dropout. And if you're asking yourself what happened after grade 6 and grade 7, the answer is very simple, of course. Bar and bat mitzvah happens. And even the drop in grade 7 is indicative of that, because there's some children, young people who celebrate their bar or bat mitzvah already toward the end of grade 6, and there's a dropout then as well. But the other thing that has to be emphasized is the very small numbers, in absolute terms, of young American Jews, aside from those in day schools, who are getting a Jewish education during their high school years, period. And that certainly ought to be sobering, particularly to Jewish institutions who increasingly are using the language of lifelong Jewish learning. The education department of the Union for Reform Judaism, for example, has renamed itself the Center for Lifelong Jewish Learning. And I admire that. I think that that's what Jewish education is. It is a lifelong enterprise. But what this dramatizes is that shamefully it's not happening on the ground. There is no such lifelong learning taking place. And if anything, what this highlights is a very important gap that needs to be addressed. And then just to move on from here, when we talk about school affiliation, so when we are looking at the schools themselves and break them down, where are these young people going? What's the denominational affiliation of them? And what becomes dramatic is, of course, that the plurality are enrolled in schools under reform auspices. Second come those who are in conservative schools, schools under conservative auspices, and then everything else becomes quite small. What I think is a chidush of this census is the growing role of Chabad, which has not registered on the radar screen yet of the American Jewish community. There are close to 400 schools now, Hebrew schools as they're called, by Chabad, and they're rapidly spreading. And while the enrollments there are still small, they have small numbers in each school, collectively this represents a significant sector of this population. Here is a different pie, and this is a pie that breaks down the students by the students as opposed to the schools, right? The previous one was about the schools. This is the students. And this becomes quite dramatic also because you see that the dominant population in supplementary schools is in schools under reform auspices. And the conservative piece of the pie, as you can see, is shrinking. Slightly over a quarter of children in supplementary schools are in schools under conservative auspices. In part, that is because there are far more Jews in the conservative movement who send their children to day school than is the case in the reform movement. But this is also one of the many pieces of evidence that the conservative movement is contracting, and the young population is contracting as well. I also note to you that while the Chabad slice in terms of school affiliation was quite significant, when we actually look at the number of children, they're still quite few. These are still small programs, and yet we want to pay attention to that. I want to move on from here and say that by way of just wrapping this demographic piece up, we're talking about a population of somewhere in the vicinity of 230,000 or so young people, maybe 240,000 who are enrolled in supplementary schools in the United States between the grades 1 and 12. I'm sorry? 200? Yes, because my figures, as I admitted at the outset, did not include all the schools. I was not able to reach all the schools. And so I am projecting an additional sum for those. But it's a fair comment that you're making. There was one dimension, and by the way, by way of comparison, there are about 175,000 Jewish kids in day schools between grades 1 and 12. There were also some who were in early childhood programs, and I've been criticized for leaving them out, but I want this to be parallel. Supplementary schools don't have kindergarten programs or pre-K programs, so I want this to be parallel. And there is a new census that Marvin Schick is going to be producing in the coming months of day schools, which will indicate that they, in fact, are growing. They have grown further. I asked one set of questions that really are not strictly speaking questions that belong on a census, but my Yetzer Hara got the best of me. I asked questions about their possible school priorities. And I gave them a list of possibilities and asked them to identify their 3 top priorities. And the them that I asked are school directors, who are the main respondents to the census. And I have to take responsibility for this listing. It's not exhaustive. I've been criticized for leaving out other potential questions. I didn't ask, for example, whether their priority is helping young people develop a relationship with God. That's an item that could be included here. And there are other items that in theory could be included here as well. So we're working off of what my list. Anybody want to take a guess as to which of these was ranked the highest overall? In terms
of what the directors prioritized, or what they said their customers prioritized?
No, the directors. The directors, not the parents. The directors. Any of you want to take a stab at that?
Parents showing to live in a decent.
To be decent. Okay, Menschlich, right? Okay, that's a possibility. And you had a different...
I think teaching of holidays and rituals.
Okay. Hebrew for the services. All right, we'll come back to that. Okay. Well, yes, and that's related. Yes, yes. You're both wrong. Okay. And you come closer, but still, this is how they actually came out in the rankings. Okay? Giving children positive Jewish experiences was the most popular of the items. And then come other items. Here comes the Hebrew reading. But there was an enormous variation by denomination. Schools under conservative auspices were the most likely to identify that as a high priority. Okay? The Hebrew reading for participation in religious services. Right? Yes, yeah. And there were other schools, clearly, that ranked the positive Jewish experiences very high. The Chabad schools particularly ranked that very high. And then, of course, come the holidays and rituals, which you pointed out. The Menschlich piece, comes in over here. You will note that Israel doesn't figure on this list at all.
I was going to ask about
Yeah.
that.
No.
How many percentage did Israel?
I have it in the booklet. I can tell you. Well, Alex is speaking. We'll have a conversation. No, I'll let you know about that. But these were the top ones. Afterwards, everything is really quite low. Now, I think I want to just spend some time on this point, and with that, I will conclude. Even though I have a PowerPoint that could go for 3 hours. Say it again. Israel was not one of the top priorities. I promise you, I will look it up and I'll tell you where it was, but it was very low as an item. But again, in fairness, I didn't ask them whether it is a priority, but whether it's one of the top 3 priorities. Okay? I want to pause on this because, and here I want to just fill you in very briefly about this other project, which the findings of which are now in print. I put together a team of basically 5 of 2 different types of observers. 5 academics, and I paired them with 5 experienced school people who not only had taught in supplementary schools, but who had actually run supplementary schools. And I took 1 academic and 1 what I'll call practitioner, experienced practitioner. Each of these teams of 2 visited 2 different schools. It's a separate project. And what we were trying to do was to identify schools that seemed to be doing a good job, who could serve as models for other schools. We were looking, in other words, for success, not for failure. And successes that might be emulated as well. And we found some very interesting schools. We looked at large ones, small ones. I have to add here parenthetically, 60% of supplementary schools have enrollments of 100 or fewer children. All right? Most supplementary, and 40%, by the way, have under 50 children. Most supplementary schools are small. And that raises all kinds of interesting questions about how to support small schools, which obviously will also be under-resourced and understaffed. So we took a look at larger and smaller schools. We found a couple of small schools that were really very, very strong, very good, and made really the most of what they had, and then some. We also studied larger schools, different parts of the country, different affiliations, and so on. And there's a report that I put out. It's called Schools That Work. You can find it and download it at the avichai.org website, avichai.org website. And it's called Schools That Work. And there's also a book that came out which contains 10 portraits, and the title is Learning and Community. I'm not here to promote that, but rather the point I want to make is this. We found interesting schools, good schools, hard-working schools, and that's what the title really means, schools that work. They're working hard. The area that they were weakest in was in answering the question, what are your school's objectives? What are you trying to accomplish? They had great difficulty articulating that. Now, some of them could articulate The first item up here, we want the kids to have good Jewish experiences. Okay? Now, that's a pretty open-ended learning goal, right? And it can be interpreted in any number of ways, right? And what kind of experiences? Schools had a lot of difficulty defining that, let alone answering the question, okay, so this is your school's objective. How do you intend to get from here to there? In other words, what are you going to do in grade 1, in grade 2, in grade 3, in grade 4, and accomplish each year that will enable you to produce the types of students that you are aspiring to produce? They couldn't answer those questions. And I'm not ridiculing by saying that. I appreciate the fact that these schools are under-resourced. Many of them are headed up by part-time school heads. The instructional staff, the teachers, are primarily part-time. They are very constrained in what they do.
What percentage of the staff are your team, former Israelis?
Oh, it's much lower than it used to be. There was a time when your dean played a much larger role than they do today. But I must say that I only know this in roundabout ways. It's a fine question to ask. We need to know more about the instructional staff of the schools. The second,
How many of the students are from your dean?
Maybe we'll have...
that we don't know.
Hold
Yeah.
the questions
Yes.
till the end of the lecture.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
Thanks.
So one aspect has to do with how capable are schools of defining their own school objectives. The other dimension of this is, and even if they can do this, to what extent do they engage in some kind of learner assessment? In other words, to measure, and I'm not only talking about testing, but to find ways of measuring to what extent the learners are learning what they hope that they will learn, experiencing what they hope they will experience. These are ways of thinking that are largely alien to these schools. And again, I understand all the reasons why that is the case. But what I want to underscore is that even in the best of schools, in the best of circumstances, this is a highly problematic area. And so I said before that the purpose of this particular project really was research that was action-oriented. The action that we're talking about was to provide schools with some of the tools so they could learn from other places, other schools. And then there's some larger implications that come out of this particular project. And what I just spoke about now is one of those larger implications. That if these schools are to improve, they have to pay more attention to their objectives and measuring, finding ways to measure their outcomes. Let alone the third piece of this, which is to find ways to feed their assessment back into changes and improvements in their schools. And that all of that is part of this notion of schools that work. And my argument is that not only do we have to think about schools that seem to be doing a good job, but there is an integral connection between working quite hard in these areas and that feedback loop which enables the schools to improve and to ratchet up their performance. With that, I will conclude, and thank you.
That was a very comprehensive picture in a very short time. Thank you very, very much. And I just feel vindicated as someone who works in philosophy of Jewish education. We asked the question, what are the ends of Jewish education? What are we educating for, etc. So I feel sort of vindicated about that. Any questions for Professor Wertheimer? Yeah, Vakasha. Jack. Abortion.
In some ways, I'm probably the youngest one here, and I went to a conservative supplementary school, and it was I would call it an abject failure. I think that the liturgy is absolutely meaningless to us. Most people.
I got a message.
Yeah.
Now that I've heard it before, okay, no, I understand what you're driving at. I understand what you're driving at. So no, keep on going through all those examples. There's much that we didn't learn. Right? That's the key message. So do I take one question at a time?
Let's try a couple, and then we'll field a couple more. Yes, Bakasha.
Thank you. At the very end, you talked about schools not having objectives, not knowing their objectives. Now, more than half of the schools were either in the reform or conservative movements. I'm just wondering if the movements themselves don't have curricula and objectives that they share with the leaders. And also, if you'd be willing to ruminate about whether these schools are formal or informal settings of education. I'd just be interested in hearing your experience with that.
Okay. Bakasha.
Do you, two questions, one is rhetorical, non-rhetorical. Do you have any longitudinal studies on the results of this type of education neutralized from any other kinds of formal or informal education that the same young people or not so young people may have gotten? In other words, I think that one has to ask this, that's the question. Now, the rhetorical question is, are we interested in Jewish identity or are we interested in Jewish commitment? I would say there is a difference between the persons of the national Jewish population study who register themselves as Jews or even just Jews, that category, and questions of commitment, and then tying that in with the first question, do we have longitudinal follow-up as distinct from identity, the people who are committed?
We're all very personally invested in these questions. Let's keep the rhetorical questions short and the other. I know. Brenda.
I'm just wondering if the first initially positive Jewish experiences isn't some sort of reaction to the negative PR that supplementary schools done. And since we don't really know what that means, I'm just wondering if it wouldn't be helpful to supplement the census with some sort of qualitative research. I don't know if you're doing that or you consider doing that. That's the first point. And the second is, to what extent is replication really possible? I'm thinking of Dewey's Lab School, where people came from all over the United States to see what he was doing in Chicago, and no one could replicate that. To what extent is the success of each supplementary school outcome of the specific staff it has, the specific principal?
Okay. One more question, I think, is what we got time for. Yeah, on this round. Yeah.
I'm very concerned that with the results. However, I'm not surprised. My question is, while studying the schools, did you try to see the reasons, or where is Schwab's fourth a commonplace? Where is the Meliá? Where are the parents? Where is the community? Where is the support of the community? Because we can see in the United States, in a lot of Korean supplementary schools that are very successful. The Jewish people are going to supplementary activities in sport and arts, and it's very successful. Where is in the study, did you try to see where are the messages of the parents? Where is the support? Where is the fact that there's no commitment or there is this lack of
Let's have some Rahmanis on Jack. Take 4 questions at once.
And I have an hour?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to take these as best as possible in order and try to be brief because we do have other speakers. Absolutely, yes. So to begin with the question about these schools and whether they are, as you put it, an abortion or a failed experiment. Certainly there are people who feel that these schools have run their course and they ought to be disbanded. Whether or not we believe that to be the case, and there are other people who feel no, that they haven't been given a fair shake, given all the constraints that they work with, of finances, of time, of staffing, and all that, have they really been given a fair shake? I am not here to make a case for the excellence of supplementary schools. I have not hidden my preference for day school education. I'm a product of day schools. My children attended day schools, and I have never hidden that. I've written quite a bit about the virtues of day school education. But I also accept the basic reality, which is that nobody in this room and nobody anywhere that I know of has the power to close down the supplementary school system. It exists. The only way it'll be closed down is if the many thousands of individuals located in each of these communities where there are these schools will decide to close them down. So that's point number one. Point number two, this is where we have a vast number of Jewish kids. I put these two together, and my concern is, can we do better for those kids? And that's why I have focused my attention and time, invested my time in this. What more can we do for these kids? There is a great deal that these schools cannot teach, cannot transmit by virtue of their severe time constraints. How much Hebrew can you teach? And yet, we did study one particular school that made it its top priority to teach Hebrew, and lo and behold, the kids in that school who attend twice a week speak Hebrew in their classes. Supplementary school. So it's possible to do, okay? This is an extraordinary school, and it's serving as a model now for others. I can't tell you its name because I promise confidentiality, although anybody who knows about these schools can figure out which it is. But we're not in a position to shut these places down. Maybe at one point they will be shut down, but then we have to ask ourselves, what can replace them? Because, and this connects to your question in one way, because there are a great many parents who will not consider sending their kids to Jewish day schools, and if anything, we're living in a time financially where even people who are committed to day school education feel they can't afford it anymore. Okay, and so there's now discussion going on about these charter schools, and what's going to happen to the kids in the charter schools. For their religious education, they're going to be put into a supplementary school program. So there's a renewed discussion about that. The role of the denominations that was posed. Yes, the denominations do, in fact, set out some objectives. The Reform movement put out a high curriculum in which they invested millions of dollars. And it's a very fine curriculum, used in some conservative schools as well. The problem is that most schools under Reform auspices don't have the personnel to handle that curriculum. They don't themselves. They don't have the knowledge. The teachers don't have the knowledge to handle it, and the people in the Reform movement will admit that. So it's well and good for these movements to try to put out these objectives, but if the schools don't have the wherewithal, they can't do very much about it. The longitudinal studies. The question was posed about that. No, the informal settings you also asked about. Yes. All of these schools, and that has been part of the revolution, I think, in supplementary school education, all of these schools try to combine the formal and the informal. And certainly amongst the better schools that we studied, all of them have quite well-developed experiential educational programs. Whether we're talking here about chesed projects, whether we're talking here about getting kids into the sanctuary, into the shul itself, and not only teaching them about tefillah, but also actually engaging them in tefillah. There are all kinds of informal and experiential modes that are being used, and that is seen, and rightfully so, as a very important intersection that has to take place. Longitudinal studies of these schools, there's been a paucity of research generally about Jewish education. Most of the data that we have really are retrospective. In other words, we look at Jewish adults who have been surveyed, and we know about their Jewish characteristics, including their commitments, not only their identity, and then we go back and we say, but what kind of Jewish education did they get? Oh, lo and behold, those who attended day school ended up having the strongest levels. I'm going to use the word engagements. You'll use the word commitments. Therefore, day schools work. Now, what we also know is that when young people are exposed to multiple forms of formal and informal Jewish education, they also demonstrate as adults that they have strong levels of engagement. So it's possible for there to be positive Jewish engagement or commitment outcomes without day schools. Just to try to wrap up one or two more of these things here. Give me just one moment to try to what I read here. Yes, the replication question. It's a great question. Schools have their own cultures, which are formed often over the course of decades. It's very difficult to try to replicate one particular model. The question is what they can learn from other schools and try to work it into their own culture, rather than try to lift something and impose it upon their own institution. And last of all, the question of parents and community. This is what so many of these projects are trying to do. They're trying to bring a degree of alignment into the schools so that it's the rabbi and the cantor and the school director and the teachers and the parents who are all working together and are on the same page about what they're trying to accomplish. But that again means that they know what they want to accomplish. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jack. If there are any further questions, please save them for the end of the session, because we do have to keep to a maximum 40-minute both presentation and question for each speaker. So I think our next one is going to be Dr. Alex Pomsson, our expert in community schools and day schools. Bevakasha.
Okay, I'm going to make an apology and tell you up front that I'm going low tech, having been burnt at this particular conference on too many previous occasions. I'm using this opportunity as a kind of therapy to put PowerPoint behind me and return to the written word. And I hope you'll still be alive and with me by the time I finish. Okay, the Contemporary Diaspora Jewish Day School. That is an all-day school that provides both Jewish and general education, has its origins in two distinct traditions, one integrationist, one survivalist. The first tradition, with its origins in the lofty goals of not yet emancipated 18th century German Jewry, saw the Jewish school as a bridge to participation in civic and national life. The second tradition, forged in the early part of the 20th century by a generation of Jewish immigrants to the United States, fearful for the survival of Judaism, saw the day school as a fortress to prevent Judaism being overwhelmed by contemporary society. Over the last 200 years, the fortunes of these traditions have waxed and waned. As Jews achieved emancipation and gained relatively equal access to public education, the first integrationist tradition lost much of its raison d'etre. The all-day Jewish school seemed not only an anomaly, but an unpatriotic impediment to upward social mobility. However, with an almost global movement to, quote, expand and equalize educational opportunities for all classes of citizens, having brought about a perceived deterioration in the standards and quality of public education. That's Harold Himmelfarb, as long ago as 1989. Jews over the last quarter of a century have once more begun to conceive of private all-day Jewish day schools as a preferred route to social and educational success, much as the Haskalah pioneers once did. The survivalist tradition, a direct descendant of the traditional Cheder, with its curriculum of intensive Jewish study, appealed at the start of the 20th century only to a small and often impoverished minority in Europe and North America. Yet over the last half-century, as Orthodox Jewry has experienced a demographic and ideological revival, and as non-Orthodox Jews have exhibited increased concern about whether their grandchildren will be Jewish, many parents and policymakers have come to see the Jewish day school, with its core curriculum of Jewish study and experience, as the most effective means for guaranteeing the survival of Jews and Judaism in open societies. Jacob said it himself. In my presentation, I sketched the particular features of these two day school traditions, since in my view, outside Haredi communities, they no longer exist as alternatives, but are increasingly seen as complementary, if not always compatible models for Jewish schooling. I argue that the challenges in reconciling these traditions accounts for some of the most intense contemporary debates surrounding day school education in relation to educational goals, curriculum, marketing, and recruitment. I survey these debates as well as other central trends in day school education, review the questions and concerns that have been of most interest to researchers of day schools, and then finish by proposing a research agenda for the next decades of day school research, and I'll be done in 25 minutes. The first modern all-day Jewish day schools were opened under the influence of Jewish Enlightenment thinkers in the late 18th century in Berlin and then in other German cities. These schools differed from previously existing institutions for the provision of Jewish education by delivering a curriculum that included both Jewish and secular studies, not just study of traditional Jewish texts, and by their being open to all Jewish children, not just the offspring of the wealthy or the learned. The intent of such schools was, in the words of Naphtali Hertz Wesley, one of their earliest ideologues, so that, quote, the children of Israel will also be men who accomplish worthy things, assisting the king's country in their actions, labor, and wisdom, close quote. In the case of the Berlin school, in fact, non-Jewish students were also admitted, since it was assumed that social and academic contact between Jews and Jewish and non-Jewish children would facilitate integration and cooperation between them as adults. As I have argued in a number of places, the most fully realized institutional expression of this educational vision was seen at the end of the 19th century in England, where by 1899, the Jews' Free School, the JFS, with more than 4,000 students, had become the largest school in Europe, not just Jewish school, but the largest school in Europe. According to one historian of the school, the JFS was conceived by its founders so as, quote, to refashion the young by taking them off the streets and putting them in a modern Jewish school where they would learn artisan skills and English manners, close quote. The student body was almost entirely made up of the children of poor immigrants, and the school was widely admired for gathering, quote, within its walls the children of those who were driven here by persecution, making of them good and desirable citizens of our beloved England, close quote. This outcome, known by admirers and critics as Anglicization, was forged, it was claimed, on a bedrock of Jewish religious values. But it's notable that although the school was conceived as a religiously orthodox institution, rarely was more than 1 hour a day devoted to instruction in Jewish values and associated texts. The remaining 5 or 6 hours of daily instruction was devoted to a broad curriculum of general studies as well as to the preparation for various artisan trades. Now, the rhetoric of the Berlin Maskilim and of the JFS patriots may be alien today, but in functional terms, their view of what the Jewish day school promises is not so different from what is proposed by those who currently promote day school education, especially to liberal Jews. For example, the Day School Advocacy Forum, a community-based network in Boston, advises, quote, that day school marketing and advocacy should focus on the quality of math, science, and English. No mention of Jewish studies, of course. Adopting a more scholarly stance, researchers at Brandeis University commissioned to explore the question, what difference does day school make, found, quote, that day schools provide top-notch preparation for a broad range of colleges and universities, including those that are the most selective, close quote. In both of these cases, the day school's appeal is assumed to be contingent on its capacity to serve and to be seen to serve as a portal to academic and material success in the wider society. This view of the day school's purpose is quite different from that inscribed in what I previously called the survivalist tradition. When all-day Jewish schools were established in the United States in the years between the First and Second World Wars, they were animated by a different impulse. While Jewish immigrants widely regarded the nation's public schools as gateways to the opportunities promised by America, Jewish day schools were regarded by their founders as, quote, fortresses or bulwarks to protect Judaism from being overwhelmed. While public schools were, in the words of one Cincinnati leader, quote, temples of liberty where children of the high and low, rich and poor, Protestants, Catholics and Jews mingle together, play together and are taught that we are free people, close quote, day schools were seen as training grounds for the future leadership of its community, its priesthood, as Dushkin put it. In the words of one prominent school leader writing at mid-century, these schools with a curriculum that devoted at least the first half of every day to the study of traditional Jewish texts provided, quote, the safest assurance for the continuation of Jewish life and the survival of Jewish culture, close quote. In their early years, this conception drew a chorus of disapproval, most famously from the proponents of Americanization in what Dr. Sampson Benderly coined the double school system, a system of Hebrew schools which our children can attend after their daily attendance in public schools. From the perspective of those who criticize the day school, its undoubted promise of Jewish group survival came at too high a price. what one opponent called the price of segregation. The school's establishment pointed towards narrow intellectual and social horizons, to what they called a sect-divided society and to an isolated Jewish group. And yet in recent years, as rates of intermarriage have soared and as levels of Jewish literacy have plummeted, segregated Jewish schooling has no longer seemed too high a price to pay for nurturing a Jewish renaissance, or at least for improving the odds that young Jews will choose to raise their own children as Jews. The confluence of these two traditions, along with other social forces such as what one might call Jewish embourgeoisement, a word I made up, I have to admit, the inclination and capacity of middle-class Jews to pay private school fees, and the confluence of multiculturalism and school choice politics, have fueled both demand for and the supply of day school education, in North America especially, but also in other countries such as England and France. By 2007, a majority of all Jewish children in England, aged 4 to 18, attended Jewish day schools, up from just 20% in 1975. In the United States, more than a quarter of Jewish children attended day schools compared with 10% in 1975. And in France, close to 40% attended day schools compared again in 1986, this time with 16%. While much of day school growth over the last 50 years can be attributed to the population growth among ultra-Orthodox Jews, still the great majority of those enrolled in the schools, the increased number of liberal schools and the enrollment of an unprecedented number of students in such schools has been remarkable. The first non-Orthodox day school in North America opened in 1951, some 50 years after the first Orthodox school. Today there are more than 150, either affiliated with non-Orthodox denominations or organized as pluralistic or non-denominational institutions, with their enrollment estimated to be between 1/5 and 1/4 of the total day school population. Growth on this scale has attracted popular comment and scholarly inquiry, but in recent years, and especially since the acute financial downturn of last year, there has been intense debate as to whether such growth can be sustained in changed economic circumstances. As I suggest, the Jewish day school's appeal has been fueled by the confluence of integrationist and survivalist traditions. This confluence also accounts for some of the most intense debates that surround schools. Scholars and practitioners debate whether such historically distinct goals can be fully compatible, or whether, as one influential educational magazine put it, whether parents will find schools to be either too Jewish or not Jewish enough. Theorists for day school education have argued otherwise. Walter Ackerman, a day school head teacher at an early stage of his career, writing 3 years before the founding of the conservative Solomon Schechter Day School Association was founded, made an argument that has been repeated down the years. Quote, "The public school is concerned with the child as an American. The afternoon religious school is concerned with him as a Jew. The conservative day school is concerned with the child who is heir to two traditions and addresses itself to the synthesis of this dual heritage within the embracive framework of Torah." A generation later, following the creation of the first Reform day schools in 1970, Michael Zeldin, the most prolific theorist of Reform day school education, again contended that liberal schools were fully able to serve multiple quotes. And I could repeat things he said that sound remarkably like those things said by Ackerman 30 years previously. Empirical research reveals, however, that the combination of integrationist and survivalist conceptions within a single school has been less seamless than day school pioneers might have hoped. In her recent dissertation, for example, Tali Hyman, conducting intensive research in a Reform Jewish high school, found a confused set of educational purposes, reflected in a disconnect between what she called the intellectually vigorous jungle gym atmosphere in general studies class and the fearful or apologetic China shop sensibilities in Judaic studies. Danny Marom, in a case study of vision-driven leadership in a non-denominational community day school, revealed how without deliberate leadership, the community day school, with its multiple purposes, can easily become what he called a cacophony of voices, a melee of pedagogical stimuli, and a marketplace for the transmission of skills. Perhaps the richest vein within which the competing or multiple purposes of the day school have been explored is in relation to curriculum. That is, in how its purposes are and might be translated into a program of learning planned and guided by the school. As seen above, the theorists of day school education had hoped that schools would provide students with a holistic experience and with equal access to a dual heritage. Over the years, a number of theoretical models and examples have been developed for how this might be done, for example, in the work of Lukinsky, Holtz, and Solomon. Despite the best intentions of curriculum designers, however, the organization of schools, the preparation of teachers, the disposition of students, and what Tyek and Tobin call the grammar of schooling, have all militated against such outcomes. As Ingle and Malkus show, the terrain that connects Jewish learning with the rest of the curriculum is a borderland that requires careful negotiation between powerful interest groups who tend to pull in different directions. There is often a disconnect between practices in the Jewish and general studies classrooms. And if I had time, I could share with you a number of examples of that disconnect or of the difficulty of traversing the borderland between Jewish and general studies. It seems, as Michael Zeldin indicated in an influential piece, that successful integration and interaction in Jewish day schools calls for schools to pay attention to all four of what Bowman and Dill, in their influential sociology of organizational change, identify as the frames of school life: human resources, structure, politics, and symbol. And that is a challenge that few school leaders can ever meet. One last realm where the tensions created by the confluence of integrationist and survivalist conceptions has been evident is in relation to the marketing of schools. During the early decades of the liberal day school, it was widely assumed, and moderately confirmed by research, that many, if not most parents, were attracted to non-Orthodox schools in spite of their Jewish curriculum, seeing them as superior alternatives to a decaying public system. More recent research suggests a more complex picture of parents wrestling with commitments both to public education and to Jewish engagement, of students and parents navigating among multiple worlds, and of liberal parents looking for and finding meaning for themselves in their children's Jewish school. What more recent research shares with the earlier studies of the liberal day school is recognition that a majority of those parents whose children today attend liberal schools, and possibly modern Orthodox day schools too, did not attend such schools themselves. This not only makes the marketing of schools more challenging, it also places a strain on schools to generate a shared and reasonable set of expectations among those they serve. As the mission of the non-Haredi Jewish day school has evolved to include both an integrationist and survivalist agenda, and as its clientele have changed, so schools have been asked to assume an accumulating burden of social tasks. Jewish children were once expected to acquire knowledge of Judaism, develop attitudes about the Jewish world, and learn Jewish behaviors from people and places in their immediate surroundings, in the family, in the synagogue, and even on the street. Today, responsibility for the emotional, moral, and interpersonal development of Jewish children has been increasingly devolved to schools. In many ways, the challenges posed by these changes are similar to those faced by public school educators who have been called upon by governments to take up roles once performed by families, religious institutions, and workplaces. For Jewish day schools, one of the most surprising ramifications of these developments is that schools have become some of the major providers of informal Jewish education. Faculty trained to teach academic subjects in classroom settings are now asked to provide Jewish experiences such as religious holy day celebrations, residential Shabbat retreats, and trips to Israel that were once the responsibility of synagogues, families, or youth groups. These changes are challenging schools, as is seen in professional journals for Jewish teachers that discuss, for example, how to nurture spirituality in day schools, or how to make the most of educational travel and student exchange. Inevitably, perhaps, research literature has only slowly emerged to capture and examine aspects of these changing roles. For the moment, the professional day school literature suggests that schools may have undergone a shift from a paradigm of instruction concerned with helping children to acquire knowledge of the ideas and skills that society values to one of enculturation, the more broadly conceived task of initiating children into a culture to which they may not already be committed. This is much like the shift called for a generation ago in Jewish supplementary schools by Aaron and others. Another concern to emerge from the evolving profile and purposes of schools relates to their capacity to serve an increasingly diverse student body. For most of the 20th century, day school families were typically synagogue members, residents of Jewish neighborhoods, and had been recipients of a relatively intensive Jewish education themselves. With few exceptions, day school parents were Jewish from birth, Orthodox in denominational orientation, and married to other Jews. Paying for all-day Jewish schooling constituted, therefore, the most complete expression of an intensely engaged Jewish identity. Today, in many countries, Jewish day schools have successfully recruited increasing numbers of families with diverse religious commitments. As I argued earlier, many of the families being drawn to Jewish elementary schools lack an intensive Jewish education of their own and depend on schools to teach their families Jewish practices and ideas that extended Jewish families had previously been able to provide from their own social and cultural resources. At the high school level, this phenomenon takes on an even more challenging aspect, with schools enrolling a significant minority of students who had not previously received an intensive Jewish elementary school education. More than ever before then, schools must figure out how to meet the needs of an increasingly diverse group of students sitting in their classrooms. There's one more concern that has increasingly surfaced with the evolution of the day school profile and mission, one that relates to the financing and cost of day school education. Of course, the heavy burden of day school finance has never been limited to schools of one denomination or another. But as day schools have started to appeal to a greater diversity of Jewish families, speculation has increased about the extent to which the high cost of private day school education, rather than issues of principle, has been a deterrent to a more extensive enrollment. At the same time, it is commonly assumed that while highly affiliated and highly orthodox Jews are less sensitive to increases in the cost of day school education because of their a priori commitment to parochial Jewish schools, moderately affiliated families will be much more likely to withdraw from schools if their fees continue to rise. I could give you some examples of research that explore that hypothesis, but I'll simply sum up by saying that there's not a great deal of research, and as a result, the literature that debates these issues tends to be cautionary, speculative, or in the worst case, alarmist when it comes to the rising cost of day school education. In the time that remains, I want to argue that despite its recent proliferation, empirical research concerned with Jewish day school education still tends to remain focused around two primary themes. And as a consequence, I suggest where the most significant lacunae continue to exist in this field. Putting it crudely, empirical day school research kind of post-mortem obsession with the lasting effects of day school education on the Jewish identities and behaviors of graduates. Most commonly, these matters have been explored as part of larger projects that seek to compare the impact of day schools with other vehicles for Jewish education. But there have also been a small number of case studies focused on the impact of individual schools on their alumni. The combined message of these studies is that day schools do have a superior impact on measures of Jewish identification when compared with other forms of Jewish education. But then, as Chertok and others caution, because of the relatively recent development of liberal day school education, there is currently a lack of data systematically gathered on the long-term impact of this educational option. Finally, the proliferation of day school research reflects, in my view, the fact that the emergence of the day school and its integration in what I have called survivalist and integrationist conceptions of Jewish schooling represents nothing less than a reassessment of what it means to be Jewish in the world. Nevertheless, there are two significant gaps in the field's research literature whose redress would serve its further development. First, while it is reasonable to assert that all-day Jewish schools have a positive effect on measures of Jewish identification that no other educational vehicle can match, little is known about why Jewish day schools produce the effects they do. We don't know, for example, to what extent these positive effects are a consequence of what children learn and experience in school, or are a banal outcome of the fact that Jewish children spend so much time together in these settings. The Jewish school remains a black box, what happens inside hidden from view. A first task in the development of day school research is analogous to the cognitive revolution in the study of teaching that moved from the investigation of the inputs and outputs of teaching to an examination of what goes on inside the teacher's head. we need to know more about what goes on inside schools. Literature of this kind exists in abundance in the field of general education, where it is as likely to be produced by sociologists, ethnographers, and historians as by practitioners writing in an autobiographical or confessional vein. Such literature is rare, however, when it comes to Jewish day schools. A second task for research is that of developing a cross-cultural mode of inquiry. The Jewish day school has emerged as a popular and frequently normative option for the education of Jewish children in almost every community where there are at least 1,000 Jewish households. The day school is an international phenomenon, and there have been studies in a wide variety of international settings. Yet there are sharp differences between the way schools are funded, governed, and educationally organized in different countries. And there has never been an attempt to compare the commonalities and differences between schools in systematic and theoretically grounded fashion. In the same way that studying the insides of schools would open up something of a black box, so studying the outsides of schools, their contexts in relation to their particular cultural settings, would clear a good deal of the mystery that surrounds them. The emergence of the Jewish day school has been one of the most unexpected developments of Jewish social life since the Second World War. It may prove one of the most significant. Few sectors of diaspora Jewish education provide so many opportunities for research. A great deal has been written about this phenomenon over the last 50 years, but looking out on this field, while it wrestles with challenges posed by the post-2008 Great Recession, one suspects that there are still many twists and turns to come whose story is yet to be told. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We begin to see how big the field is, and this is a really great pioneering foray into it. Are there any questions for Dr. Pumson? Yes, Bakasha.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if your research included also the attitude of the kids themselves who sometimes suffer from what they call double allegiance or hypocrisy, double standards, one standard at home and the other standard in the school. And then is there a comparison between what's called the most successful schools, unless I'm mistaken, day schools are, I think, in places like Mexico, where they're very successful. And then in interviews with youth who came on Birthright or Masa programs, they said, we learned to love Hebrew here, but we hated it in schools. And then, is there a breakdown in the who are the students?
Okay.
Of course, if they're Orthodox, but in non-Orthodox, are the what percent are from intermarried? What percent are from Yehudim and so forth?
Thank you. Yes, Bakasha.
Number one, thank you for the low-tech interview. And number two, are there any studies on the cognitive results of 12 years of Jewish day school education in an area which, let's say, the question is, do the people coming out of that, what do they have to say about why be Jewish?
Yes.
My question is, when you do these studies and have these kids who come out of day schools with a positive Jewish affiliation, is there a checking to see what's been going on in the families? Because the families that are most strongly committed are sending their kids to the day school. So is there positive association because of family or because of the day school?
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Jack.
Yeah, I just wanted to. No, I wanted to ask you. There certainly are distinctions between the non-Orthodox, term I don't like, and Orthodox day schools, but there really also are quite a number of commonalities that they share, and particularly on this universalist, survivalist spectrum. Orthodox schools, particularly of the modern Orthodox and perhaps even of the centrist Orthodox, struggle with those questions as well. And so in terms of research, that we might benefit from not segregating the non-Orthodox schools, but to understand that there is a continuum of challenges.
Okay. One more question. Yeah.
Just as Worthheimer made in the research showed that the very, very dramatic drop-off in high school versus primary, and obviously the Orthodox, I'm going to
Okay, thanks. That's what we've got time for. Alex?
Thanks. Okay, I don't tend to be a quantitative researcher myself, but there are folks who do this stuff and do it very well. The person who comes to mind is Stephen Cohen, who certainly has conducted and led a number of studies that try to factor out other influences on the outcomes of day school education. In other words, try to factor out the impact of the family as compared to the school, as compared to the neighborhood, etc., etc. He also does try to distinguish between the impacts of just 7 years of day school education and of 12 years of day school education. So those kind of distinctions have been explored in the research. What hasn't been explored, and in answer to your question, is the differences between what it's like to be in a day school in different parts of the world, whether Mexico or the United States or Australia, South America and England, and I'm in the midst of trying to persuade a wealthy foundation that would be really, truly a worthwhile worldwide study. I'm yet to believe whether they will be convinced. I would say most of the focus in terms of the impact of day school has been on behavioral outcomes rather than cognitive outcomes. In other words, we don't know much about how people think as a result of their time in day schools. There's been perhaps more nuanced qualitative research of that kind inside schools, perhaps particularly comparing actually the kind of learning that occurs in Jewish studies classrooms with the kinds of learning that occurs in general studies classrooms, and whether children come to learn different ways of thinking and understanding and of questioning in those different settings. Finally, Jack's question about distinctions between orthodox and liberal, what I call liberal here, I would say the distinction is more between Haredi and everybody else, is that I think the modern orthodox schools are just as much wrestling with the tension between survivalism and integration, and that is very strongly reflected in their website, where it's interesting to note, do they prioritize, do they advertise more how many of their students went on to a year in Israel or how many have gone on to Ivy League institutions? Modern Orthodox institutions are very much part of that world. What is interesting is there is research beginning to appear on the edges of the Haredi school system. A fellow by the name of Moshe Krakowski completed a doctoral study of Haredi schools in Chicago, where he argued that one is beginning to see a greater attention to the general studies curriculum in these schools and recognizing the need to graduate students who can actually earn a living and not be dependent on the rest of us. So I would say the tension, maybe that sounds a little harsh, but the tension, I think, is pervasive across the liberal, modern Orthodox sectors, but much more muted in the Haredi sector.
Thank you very, very much. Very fine professional presentation. Our next speaker will take us to another part of the world, Simon Paritzky, to the state of Jewish education in the former Soviet Union. Fascinating subject, if the black box, if there ever was one.
I already feel guilty for using color in my presentation, more than 2 colors. I'm supposed to speak about new trends in FSU Jewish education. And I just want to warn you that I'm not going to talk about revolutions and any revolutionary trends in Jewish education, but more about micro trends, which to me seem indicative of forthcoming greater trends. So I will focus on several interesting and indicative to me micro trends in FSU Jewish education, and this phrase from the Talmud, which is from the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, who is not studying Torah in Bet Midrash, but is studying Torah in the marketplace of a Roman city. יושב ועוסק בתורה בשוק התחתון של ציפורי. To me, it's a kind of a good epigraph and a good key phrase describing some of those micro trends which I would like to share with you. My presentation is based on several sources which you can see, and I just show it to emphasize that my background research is based and biased by more qualitative than quantitative research. And I will not show graphs and cite many numbers, but I do have some of statistics, but it's more based more on qualitative research. So I will structure my presentation in a very good Schwabian mode of taking into account the major factors, the major educational factors and commonplaces. So episode 1 of my show is called The Learner. And here I will be talking about the emergence of 2 new profiles of a learner in FSU Jewish education. The first profile is, I call it the natural Jews. It has to do with the fact that when we were talking, we have been talking for about 20 years now about FSU Jewry as a Jewry which comes back to Judaism, which rediscovers or discovers its Judaism, and all the Jewish organizations and educational efforts were built on presumption that the FSU Jewry is Tinokot Shenishbu, is Agala Reika, is a Tabula Rasa Jewry. All kinds of phrases were used to describe the Jews who were discovering their Jewishness. And now we have, after 20 years of Jewish education, we have the first generation of Jews which are naturally Jewish, which do not discover their Jewishness anymore. They went to a Jewish kindergarten. They went to Jewish camps. They see the Chabad menorah on the Red Square. They see the poster, 100-meter size poster, which says Spring Pesach Matzah on the biggest stadium in St. Petersburg. So Judaism and Jewish culture and Jewish education is all over the place, is available. Jewish knowledge is everywhere, in the internet, in the books. In any bookstore has a big shelf of literature and books on Jewish subjects. So Jewish knowledge is available. Jewish community is known. Anything is, the excitement of forbidden fruit is gone. And now we are talking about the gap between the previous generation, which are now Jewish educators. So the Jewish educators now, they are the generation of those who discovered their Judaism in late 80s, early 90s. Though they were the enthusiastic activists, community activists who discovered their Judaism and started to teach in all kinds of environments and schools and Sunday schools and camps. And now we have the situation where the educators represent the previous generation, the new Jews, or the discovering Jews, and the learner, the profile of the learner has drastically changed. And now they meet the learner who does not need somebody to tell him about Pesach or about holidays, about how he knows it, or he knows where to learn about it. So we have a completely new challenge of not of presenting Judaism as something new for the new learners, but to making it relevant, to making it part of their life. Why? They are now asking, we know that there is Judaism, we know all that we want to know about, but why should we know? So we come to the next stage, which I think that this is the situation in the United States and other countries. So we have joined the club now. So this is the first thing. The next profile, which is very interesting to me from the sociological point of view, is the emergence of a new class of urban professionals looking for intellectual pleasures, which I call hipsters. Not just I, but some sociologists in Russia called hipsters class. It exists only in large cities like Moscow, less so in St. Petersburg. Mostly in Moscow, it's a 12 million city, where there is a class of students and professionals and designers and artists and journalists who actually live in clubs. They work there, they dine there, the clubs are open 24 hours a day, they meet their friends there, they write on their laptops, and they have their leisure and entertainment and education and everything they have in clubs. And so they are just living in such an environment. And now we have a very large section of Jewish population belonging to this hipster class. And now I will show a few of characteristics of this class and we'll try to ask some educational questions about them. So first, it's what one can call a multi-tab mind. One of the definitions of a hipster by Russian sociologists, it's a person who uses a multi-tab browser, opens 10 or 20 tabs in this browser, and is jumping between them. And so it's called a kind of horizontal mind. He's in a kind of horizontal space where he can jump between all kinds of tabs. And tabs, they can be from New Yorker and Design Magazine and Jewish site and some Russian cultural site. And he's just living in this multi-tab space. And here we have two challenges in terms of Jewish education. One is that the natural challenge is trying to squeeze as much Jewish tabs in this universe as we can. So try to have this tab devoted to Jewish books and a tab devoted to Israeli cultural programs, trying to fill this horizontal space. And it is happening. There is, for example, here you can see it's a site called Booknik, which is very popular. And it's this site, it's devoted to Jewish books and culture, and it is one of the sites which succeeded into squeezing into this multi-tab universe. But the challenge, the educational challenge, is that by statistics tell us that the person spends from 1 to 3 minutes in each tab. So you can, from 1 to 3 minutes. So, for example, the Booknik site is struggling to get his audience to have the audience to spend 1.5 minutes and not 1 minute. So it's a struggle between 1.5 minutes and 2 minutes. And this is the wholly different educational format. When we need to present an appealing Jewish content in 1 or 2 minutes, it's totally different skill, different educational skill, and demands total different training for those who are involved in this kind of education. And the second challenge is here below. It's about escaping the horizontal, because what we are aware of and what the Russian sociologists are also aware of, that the multi-tab mind is a kind of prison, because a person is imprisoned in this horizontal universe, and there is some deeper necessity of a person to connect to a vertical, some vertical space, so to escape from this horizontal existence. So Jewish education and Jewish culture and Judaism can be one of those vertical spaces, but it demands totally different educational endeavors. So this is one thing. Next thing is characteristic of this hipster class is hedonism. We were used to call Russian Jews intellectuals or intelligentsia, because the Russian Jews were very much identified with the class of Russian intelligentsia, and they were intellectuals and were all about knowledge. We used to call the Russian Jews not just cosmopolitans. We used to call them Nishma ve'na'aseh Jewry, not Na'aseh ve'nishma, because the Russian Jew wants to know before he is ready to do anything. First he wants to know. Now the situation is different. Now knowledge is not an issue. You can get knowledge everywhere very quickly. And people are not looking for knowledge, they are looking from the pleasures they can derive from this knowledge. And we have and this class of hipster intellectuals and nightclub frequenters, they have a special demand for knowledge, for such kind of knowledge, which they can derive intellectual pleasures from. And this demands different formats, and I will talk about formats in the next. This is just, I want to comment on the picture. This is the site devoted to public lectures, available in Moscow at each moment. So a person who enters this site can see that this evening he can attend 20, 30 public lectures, workshops, all kinds of events, learning events in Moscow. And all of them position themselves as something offering some intellectual pleasure. It's you can see it from the way it is presented. And the next thing I want to focus on is about the profile of the learner. Is the emergence of a class which they call themselves global Russians. And they even have a website and a community which is called Snob, devoted to global Russians. And this is a new, something new, because global Russian is a person who lives in London or in New York or in Russia or in Israel or in any other place on earth, who speaks Russian, but also speaks all kinds of languages, who reads New Yorker, who reads the New York Times, who reads the Russian literature, who can be anywhere in the world, but read the Russian language blogs and belong to some intellectual community of Russian speakers, and who is wealthy enough to attend concerts in any parts of the world. And why is it a challenge? Because here we first we have to think about that for a global Russian, and I now talking about Jews. So for a global Russian living in London, maybe the Jewish culture in an English context, in a British context, can be more relevant than the Jewish culture in the Russian context. So they are, and we see it on this site, that they are writing in their Russian language blogs. They are writing about what's happening in Jewish life in New York, in Manhattan, or in London, or in Amsterdam, or anywhere in the world, in Israel. They're writing about it in Russian. But they are dealing with Jewish culture in all kinds of places. So we have to also to rethink the way we are dealing with this new learner. Now, episode 2, educator. Here we also have two new profiles emerging. One is called Jews by education. We have a new generation of educators who are not community activists discovering their Judaism in the late 80s and 90s. Those who didn't have, because they didn't have the opportunity to have any systematic Jewish education and Jewish learning, who learned about Aleph, Bet, and started to teach their friends Aleph, and taught themselves Jewish studies. Now we have, for 15 years, we have invested in the academic Jewish studies in Russia, in university departments of Jewish studies. And now this investment is starting to pay off, because now we have the first generation of Jewish educators who are versed in Hebrew, Jewish mysticism, Jewish philosophy, Jewish literature, Jewish history, who are very knowledgeable and have the academic basis. And they even have their own I call it quasi-communities, because there's for example, in Moscow, you have an academic seder, you have a Purim conference, you have a Tikkun Leil Shavuot, which is a kind of congress. You have all kinds of Jewish educational projects which are devised by and serve this academic and quasi-academic community. And this is the new profile of the educator. And another profile is what I call artist in residence. I have dreamt about it for 15 years, and now we have it emerging. We have unaffiliated public intellectuals with what I call double acculturation, which means not some Russian artist or actor of Jewish descent or having some Jewish background, but we have people who are Jewish intellectuals who know Hebrew, who know how to read a Jewish text, but they are also writers, artists, journalists on the Russian scene. They're doubly acculturated, and they become a very strong factor in Jewish education. We know that places like Mandel Institute defines educator, also defines writers and artists as educators. And in Russia, for all those years, we suffered from a very limited definition of educator. Educator is a school teacher or a Hebrew teacher. This is educator. Now we have people influencing the young generation who are not educators, who are not school teachers, but they are public intellectuals. And just a few faces. Asya Weissman, she's an example of a person who graduated from Moscow State University, got her degree in Oriental Studies and Jewish Studies, in Israeli literature and Hebrew, and now she's writing a doctorate in Israeli literature. But what is she doing now? Now she's teaching topics like Arab in Israeli literature and cinema in Moscow nightclubs. So she has organized a series of lectures or educational events with cinema screenings and lectures in Moscow nightclubs about this subject. And this became a hit. It became a top hit. A lot of people came, and it's a kind of things that people are doing. Those people are doing. This new generation, they are doing. They're, I would say, translating their Jewish studies expertise into all kinds of out-of-the-box educational and cultural projects. This is another example. Motel Gerdon. He's a young Yiddishist, a verbrannte Yiddishist, which is he's invited in Tel Aviv University to teach Yiddish in summer courses of Tel Aviv University. He's a very brilliant linguist and Yiddish teacher, but he's also an example of this first generation of natural Jews. Because I remember him going to a Jewish kindergarten, then a Jewish Sunday school, then all kinds of klezmer camps, and now he's a Jewish studies scholar and educator and verbrannte Yiddishist. And it's changing the face of the Jewish education. This is one of the public intellectuals, Linar Goralik. She's an Israeli and a Russian, and she has a degree from a Beersheba University, and she's a writer. She's a very successful writer, one of the most popular now in Russian, and she's living in Moscow, and she's one of the most, this is the Snob website. She's one of those global Russians. She's living part of her time in London, part of her time in Israel, part of her time in Moscow, and she's writing in Russian, and she's very successful. And she's also translating Edgar Keret into Russian, and she's organizing all kinds of educational events in Moscow clubs for those hipster audiences. And if you ask a Jew in Moscow, who is the most influential educator today in Moscow, you'll perhaps hear that perhaps Linar Goralik is a Jewish educator. So this is a new face of Jewish education. A few things about the milieu. This is one of the things. Beyond Jewish establishment. So we had the model for 20 years that we have the GCC, or we have the Jewish school, or we have the Jewish Cultural Center, and we have to ingather or to reach to those Jews who are wandering somewhere there, to those 90% of unaffiliated Jewish population, we have to draw them into the Jewish community. We have to bring them to the JCC, or to the Jewish school, to the Sunday school. So we have the place where we ingather them. We are running around trying to draw them to us. Now the model is reverse. The opposite model, which I, in my awkward English, called outgathering. It means that we are not trying to draw them to us. We are trying to study the Torah in the marketplace of Tzipori. We are trying to study Torah in the broader sense in the places where these people are. In art galleries, we have a very successful Bet Midrash in an art gallery. In art galleries, in coffee shops, in nightclubs, in parks. Now, for example, there is a festival, a rock festival in a park, which is called a picnic. A Fisher picnic. So there is an educational component there where they have some educational events there, public lectures and workshops and all kinds of things, which is there where people come for our concerts, and in all kinds of places. So now that the trend is not to draw people to the JCC or to the synagogue, but to have Jewish education happening in the places where they are. And this gives one more thing, because this, I would say, non-systemic and out-of-the-box Jewish education gives us the opportunity to escape the state control. You know that we are now living in a Putin Russia, which is very different from the Russia we had in the 90s, with all this perestroika thing. Now we have a very strict state control and state licensing of education, of formal education. So this kind of education, which happens in nightclubs and all kinds of ways, it's a kind of bootleg learning, which is out of the system, which we don't have to license it. We don't have to ask the authorities the permission yet. So this is an area of freedom. This is just an illustration of a kind of public which comes to cafes, clubs, and galleries because the cafes and clubs and galleries, I use the sociologic term of third good place. This is not the work, this is not home, this is not private, this is not a government-controlled workplace. It's some kind of third good place where they feel comfortable, when they feel free, and well, they feel interested in this kind of education. Now, formats. Two major formats are now in trend. One is edutainment. Edutainment is an art of mixing educational cocktails. I will come to it in the next slide. And the second is routes. Not routes, meaning all kinds of trips and journeys and on-the-road activities. So edutainment is a format. It has to do with this pleasure-seeking and hedonism of this public, which is, I call it the art of cocktail mixing. To have a successful and meaningful and attractive educational event, you have to mix the strong spirits of academic expertise, fresh juice of visual, musical, and other arts, and sweet spice of humor, irony, curiosity, and surprise. It has to be a kind of cocktail. Not mechanical, or not some bonuses or tricks. It has to genuinely mix this and give people a taste of. And this taste of is a new methodology. It's a kind of, I will finish with the questions of methodology and epistemology. Because we have a problem, here's the kind of problem we have in Russian, because we don't have terms in Russian for event, for talk, for presenter, for facilitator, for workshop. All this new field of education which I'm describing is very new to the Russian environment, and we are trying to find words for it. And the epistemology, it's a challenge, because we have a taste of, which means that people do not come to this event, edutainment event, having a general notion of a general narrative of Jewish history. They get some taste of some peculiar, interesting, we call it raisins, of Jewish history, some peculiar, interesting thing. And through the taste of this peculiar, interesting thing, they want more, and they come. This is a methodology which I call part to whole. We don't start with the basics and come to specifics. We start with some very specific things and trying to use them as a prism. It's like a prismatic and non-linear narrative. So it's a challenge to, I would say, curriculum of this of these kinds of activities. And on the road, on-the-road activities, they come as an alternative to the bubble model of a camp or retreat. Because now there is a notion that in order to get the real interesting Jewish education, you have to go somewhere. You don't have to sit somewhere in the Moscow, near Moscow, in the woods, and have some imaginary shtetl there. You have to go to the real shtetl and talk to real people and make it not an excursion. It's not a tourist excursion, and it's not a trip and not a class trip. Why? Because here you see the interaction. And what do you think they are doing? What do you think the young people are doing here? They are not asking questions. It's very interesting methodology. It's I call it reverse ethnography. It's not asking the old Jews or the older population there about Jews. It's telling them stories. So we have young people coming to Midjibrzh and telling the local population stories about Besht, and coming to Satonov, and coming to Shargorod, and coming to all kinds of places in the former Pale of Settlement, and studying Jewish texts there, and interacting with the local population. And the last thing, it's just a question, the economic question. Because this question, which Chris Anderson uses in his latest work, free as in beer or free as in speech, which means we have two definitions of free. I don't know the Jews free school, it's in the second sense. But here in Russia we have it's very problematic question, because we have used to have Jewish education for free for 20 years because it was subsidized by all kinds of Jewish foundations and American federations and the JDC and the Jewish Agency and the Chabad and all kinds. And it was totally free as in beer, but it was not free at all as in speech. It was totally dependent on imported ideologies, imported models, imported ideas, and it was totally restricted and limited in the freedom of thinking and the freedom of envisioning the authentic ways of being Jewish in Russia. This is one thing. So now we have to, there is a trend of letting people pay for Jewish education to make it free as in speech, to make it free from imported models. But there is another obstacle here because connected to what Chris Anderson writes. Because in Russia, free as in beer gives you some opportunity to make it free as in speech. Because as long as you don't charge anything, you are not controlled. At the moment when you start charging a price for an educational event in the club, you become state-controlled. The state tax authorities and all kinds of authorities come and control you and license you and ask you why are you doing this and where is your profit, all kinds of questions which limit your freedom. So in another sense, it's not very good to make Jewish education paid because it's also problematic. So these are some of the issues that we struggle now and some of the micro trends which I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
That was just fascinating. It's all changed completely from the way we used to know it, and I'm very grateful to Simon for making this whole distance to tell us about it. Questions for Simon Piritzky? Yeah. Bakasha. Go to the microphone.
Where do you personally fit into this picture? What are you a product of? How did you form to a group, etc.? And does Russian youth also participate in birthright?
Yes. Okay. As for me, I'm a kind of I don't fit exactly into this picture because I'm between generations. Because I started as a person discovering Judaism in the early 90s, and I came to Jewish studies and Jewish education and all kinds at the age of 20. I was 20. So I didn't go to the Jewish kindergarten because there were no Jewish kindergartens. Yeah, and I also came to live in Israel for 2 years at the Jerusalem Fellows program. Came back, and I also fit the profile of a person who got his Jewish studies at the Russian universities. I have a degree in Jewish studies and became Jewish educator after I got my degree in Jewish studies. And I also doing some kind of edutainment events in clubs, so I also fit the third category. So, and as for birthright, the problem is that the birthright is a trip. It's an educational trip, but it doesn't fit very well into this model of a route, of a genuine journey, because here it's more like a tourist experience. And the young people who I talk to, who come to Birthright, what they look for more, I would say, tough experience, more tough encounter with Israeli reality. Not just sitting in a bus and touring Jerusalem and with a lot of security and going out with in groups and meeting people.
I agree with Professor Cohen, this is fascinating. But it also seems culturally specific. Does this exist in other parts of the former Soviet Union? Is this true in the Baltic states and Ukraine? Or is this really limited to Moscow? You mentioned Moscow a number of times. Also, the sense I have is that you're talking mainly about young adults. Is there any of this that's seeping into the more formal education, or this is for the people who are already past school age?
So the geographical question, it has to do with demography. About 75 or 80% of FSU Jewry lives in big cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kiev. So when we are talking about major trends in FSU Jewish education, we are talking about big cities. And the demographers say that in the nearest future there will only be Jewish communities and thriving Jewish communities in big cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kiev. And this picture and these micro trends which I pointed to, they relate differently to different geographical regions. For example, this class of hipsters, they exist mostly in Moscow. But for example, new kinds of educators with Jewish studies degrees, and on the road, the trend of doing Jewish education on the road is spreading also to Kiev and to St. Petersburg and to other parts. But for best or for worse, the main things are happening in Moscow because it's the biggest community.
Two more questions. One, you said that the educators are from a different generation, educated in a different way. To what extent they are influencing the educational trend of the younger children, and how they can adjust to this different approach. I have to say that it's fascinating. It's an eye-opening. It's so different than what I know about North America or England.
Or Russia.
This is so creative and so innovative. And the other thing is, it seems like the focus of Judaism is more on the cultural side rather than the religious or synagogue-centered. So how do you...
So I based it on some premises which were hidden. The premises about the Russian Jewish identity, which is Soviet and post-Soviet Russian Jewish identity, which are commonplace, which means that the Russian Jews are defined Jewishness not by religious criteria and not by halachic, but mostly by cultural definitions. And and this is still true about the younger generation. So they're defining Jewishness more like an ethnic culture or culture more than religion. And the gap between educators and learners. The educators of the previous generation, they are not very well, they're sometimes at a loss of how to respond to the expectations of this new generation, because they still teaching about holidays or about, they're teaching in a tabula rasa mode, I would say. And they are not always aware that now the learners are much more knowledgeable about Jewish subjects, can be knowledgeable about Jewish subjects. And they are not looking for knowledge, they are looking for things derivative from knowledge, which means pleasure or what the brothers Boyarin called as anamnestic pleasures, which means
researcher, but it really would help
So the statistic is that, the general statistic is that less than 10% of the Jewish population is involved in any way, any kinds of Jewish activities. So, and this was the major problem of the Jewish establishment, because the Jewish establishment, the established community, has succeeded in reaching only less than 10% of the Jewish population. And this is one data, which is important because here we are talking of partly of people who are unaffiliated, who are from these 90%. And the second was Jewish studies. My estimation is that it's not exact, but my estimation is that about 100 we have about 100 graduates each year, Jewish studies graduates with MAs in Jewish studies in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kiev mostly, and about a third of them, let's say, become involved in a Jewish education. This or and this another way.
One more short question. Short.
I'd like to ask you, have you and others like you tried to involve non-Jewish personalities by offering them a free trip to Israel, and then with the hope that when they would come back with their enthusiasm, they would influence these non-affiliated Jews? It works very well in America.
Mm-hmm.
And,
yeah.
What about do many Russian Jews regard an Israeli passport as sort of like an insurance if God forbid they need it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true about the Israeli passport, but the Russian personalities which we can bring to Israel and they can influence the public opinion, it happens, for example, when the Jewish studies were established in Russian universities, the first thing to do was to take the rector of the state university to Israel, to this place, to the Hebrew University, and show him what Jewish studies is, because mostly the rectors of Russian universities, they don't have a notion about Jewish studies. So they come here, they see that this is the Hebrew University and meet the Jewish studies scholars, and they come back and establish the Jewish studies department there. It works. But I would like to relate to it by a more general thing, that about the openness to the non-Jewish environment. There's a paradox, perhaps a paradox, that those 90% of unaffiliated Jews who don't come to the Jewish community, they won't ever come to an event which is restricted to Jews or to Jewish population. They will come only to an open event, because to them, the event which is defined as only Jewish or restricted to Jews is unappealing, is impossible to go there. They just won't go there. So
that's their cosmopolitan identity. Yes. I want to thank all of our speakers for fascinating presentations.